Around the World Lit Audio. Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Epilogue. Week 9. The final episode. Full narration script. Channel intro. Welcome to Around the World Lit Audio, the greatest novels ever written, from every corner of the world, in English. New chapter every week. Free to listen. Chapter recap. In week 8, Svidrigailov walked through St. Petersburg at night making his final arrangements, giving money to Sonya, settling what could be settled, dreaming of a child whose smile contained everything he had done. He went to a watchtower in the early morning. He said, "I am going to America." Raskolnikov went to Sonya and said, "I am going to confess today." He walked to the police station, stopped, went to the Haymarket, knelt in the square and kissed the ground while people watched and some laughed. Then he got up, went inside, and said, "It was I who killed the old pawnbroker woman and her sister Lizaveta with an axe and robbed them." 8 years. Sonya followed him to Siberia. And in the second winter, something shifted. The epilogue. The final episode. Epilogue. The trial had been brief. This was noted at the time and afterward. The brevity of a trial for a double murder, the relative lightness of the sentence, the various factors that the court had weighed and found significant, the voluntary confession, the state of Raskolnikov's health at the time of the crime, the fever, the documented delirium, the fact that he had given almost all of the stolen money to a widow for her husband's funeral expenses, having derived essentially no material benefit from the murders, the testimony of various people, who described him as a person of good character in ordinary circumstances. 8 years of hard labor in Siberia. He served them in a labor camp in Siberia near a town on a great river, one of the wide Siberian rivers, that move through landscapes so vast that the human presence along their banks seems provisional, temporary, a thing that the landscape tolerates without particularly caring about. Sonya had come. She had arrived shortly after Raskolnikov and had established herself in the town near the camp, found work as a seamstress, found a room, and arranged her life in the specific way of someone who has made a decision, and is now implementing it without drama. The prisoners knew her. They liked her in the way that people sometimes like, almost involuntarily, someone whose goodness is genuine rather than performed, whose presence makes things slightly better without any obvious mechanism. Raskolnikov's mother did not know he was in Siberia. She had been told he had gone abroad on some necessary business. She had not entirely believed this but had chosen to believe it, had chosen the version of events that allowed her to continue, which is a choice that people sometimes make when the alternative is insupportable. She had been declining since his arrest, had stopped asking questions whose answers she could not endure, had moved into a state of declining health that was partly physical and partly the specific failure of a person who can no longer sustain the effort of existing in the world as it is. She died in the first year. She died believing, or choosing to believe, that her son was somewhere doing something, and that he would come back, and that things would be all right. Dunya married Razumikhin. This was the outcome that the novel's logic had been pointing toward, to people of practical intelligence and genuine warmth, whose friendship had been tested and deepened by everything that had happened, arriving at the place where friendship becomes something more. They were content together. They planned to come to Siberia eventually, when Raskolnikov's sentence was further reduced to be near him. Raskolnikov worked. He worked in the Siberian winter and the Siberian summer, the 2 seasons of that part of the world, each extreme, each demanding in its own way. He worked without complaint, with the flat endurance that had always been his mode of engagement with what could not be changed. He was not loved by the other prisoners. He remained closed, contained, different in a way they could sense without being able to describe. He was loved by no one except Sonya. She came to see him whenever the regulations permitted. She brought him things, food sometimes, news from the town, the small reports of ordinary life that constitute connection when connection has limited channels. He received her visits with the specific quality of a man who knows something is good for him and is not yet fully able to receive it. He was ill in the first winter, a serious illness, the specific kind that Siberian winters produce in bodies that are already worn. He lay in the prison hospital and was tended by the doctors and survived, which surprised some people and did not surprise Sonya. In the illness he had time to think. He thought about the theory. He had been thinking about the theory since the confession, had been turning it over with the specific attention of someone who built something carefully and is now examining the construction looking for where it failed. The theory was elegant. The logic was internally consistent. The extraordinary man, the right to transgress, the arithmetic of one life weighed against the good that might be done. He had believed it. He had constructed it not as a justification for something he already wanted to do but as a genuine intellectual position, had arrived at the conclusion through argument and had then acted on it. The action had not produced what the theory predicted. He had not felt like Napoleon. He had felt like a man who had killed 2 people. He had not used the money, had not been able to use it, had hidden it under a stone as though its touch was dangerous. The theory had said, if you are extraordinary, transgression will feel like transgression feels to an extraordinary man, like an exercise of power, like clarity, like the freedom of someone not bound by the ordinary laws. What it had actually felt like was the pawnbroker's eyes going dark, and Lizaveta in the doorway, and the sound of feet on the stairs. The theory was not wrong because it had unpleasant consequences. Theories can be true and have unpleasant consequences. The theory was wrong because the premises were wrong. He was not extraordinary. No one was. The category did not exist. The line he had believed divided the extraordinary from the ordinary, the line that some men could cross, and remain themselves, was not a line between 2 kinds of people. It was a line between the person he had been before he crossed it, and the person he was afterward. Crossing it had not revealed what he was. It had changed what he was. He thought, Pangloss thought this was the best of all possible worlds, and that was wrong. I thought there were extraordinary men exempt from ordinary law, and that was wrong. Both of us built elegant structures, and neither of us checked them against the thing that matters, which is the actual experience of actual people. He had not read Candide. He might have found it useful. The second winter came. He had the dream, the plague of absolute certainty. Everyone infected with the conviction of their own infallibility, civilization collapsing under the weight of 1,000,000 private truths. He woke from it with the specific quality of someone who has been shown something true in the only register in which certain truths can be shown. He went to find Sonya. She was by the river, in the early morning, in the particular quality of light that Siberian early mornings have, low and oblique and very clear, the kind of light that shows things without softening them. He came to her. He knelt. He wept. She understood without words, in the way that she had always understood things that could not be stated directly, with the specific intelligence of someone who has been attending to a person for a long time and has learned to read what they cannot say. She took his hands. She wept too. She said nothing. He said nothing. The river moved. This was not a resolution. 8 years do not become shorter because something shifts in the second winter. The labor continued. The cold continued. The distance from everything he had been continued. But the quality of the continuation was different. Something that had been closed had opened. Something that had been refused had been accepted. Not guilt, which he had carried throughout, but the specific acceptance that there are things you cannot think your way out of. That the route back to being a person runs through other people, and not through yourself alone. That Sonya had known this from the beginning and had waited with the patience of someone who understands that certain realizations cannot be forced, and can only be waited for. 7 more years. They would pass as years pass, some faster, some slower, each one taking something and leaving something. At the end of them Raskolnikov would walk out of the camp on a morning in spring and Sonya would be there, and the river would be moving and the light would be the Siberian light, clear and cold and very honest about what it shows. He would be 30 years old. He would have the rest of his life. What he would do with it, Dostoevsky says, could be the material for a new story. But this story was over. Series close. You have reached the end of Crime and Punishment, by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Published in Russia in 1866, when Dostoevsky was 44 years old and had already served for years in a Siberian labor camp himself, had stood before a firing squad, believed he was about to be shot, been reprieved at the last moment as a deliberate psychological torture, and served his sentence among the people his novel would later depict. He knew whereof he wrote, what he argued, through Raskolnikov and Sonya and Porfiry and the goldfish and the Haymarket and the river, is this: the punishment for crime is not the law. The law is 8 years in Siberia. The punishment is what happens inside you, between the crime and the confession, which is longer than 8 years and colder than Siberia. And the way out of the punishment is not through intelligence, which got you into it, but through something that intelligence alone cannot provide, the willingness to be seen by someone who knows the worst thing about you and has chosen to stay. Sonya stayed. That is the novel. Thank you for listening to Crime and Punishment on Around the World Lit Audio. Subscribe so you never miss a chapter. A new episode arrives every week.